Okay, in this video, we're going to go over the next step in our sculpture process, and we're actually going to start painting these today. So let's talk about the materials you're going to need, things that you want to gather and have on hand. Okay, so you're going to want your chart, all three pieces of your sculpture. So your profile piece should be completed on front and back, your forward-looking face, again, front and back, your stand. You're going to want to have a variety of paintbrushes, your paints, water, probably a paper towel, maybe a scrap of paper to test your colors on. And if you have a clear paint palette lid, like I have in this one, you either want to have a separate palette to mix your colors in, or something you can do is take a white sheet of paper, put that underneath the clear lid, and that's going to give you a much better idea of what your colors look like. I also need you to grab an eraser if you haven't finished erasing all of your pencil lines. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the first step I'm going to do today. I'm going to pause the video and move all these things out of the way so I have a little bit more room to work. Okay, so I've moved my working materials out of the way for the most part, so all you'll pretty much see during this are the paints and a little bit of my palette that I may mix some colors in. So I have my profile forward-looking piece and stand here, and at this point in the process, you should have made your cuts in both of these pieces using the instructional video that I made for you. Remember that these are going to be sliding together to create your sculpture so that they will work together as one piece eventually. At this point, we haven't finished preparing the stand. So at this point, it should have the folds, but it shouldn't be taped together and it shouldn't have any cuts in it yet. So we haven't gotten to that point. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna make sure we've taken these pieces apart. And initially, I told you leave this line, those guidelines. Well, now that we've made the cuts, we can very carefully and very gently go in and erase those guidelines. We do not need those anymore. We only needed those there so that we knew where to make the cuts in our artwork. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and erase those. You should do the same. And if you have any visible pencil marks still showing, do your best to erase those. Obviously, I'm not expecting perfection, so if maybe you worked a little bit hard in one spot and you have a little bit of pencil mark showing through, it's not the end of the world, but you're going to erase as much as you can. We're going to do the same thing on this one. You can still see that it has its guidelines. I don't need those any longer, so I'm going to go in and take those out carefully, holding my paper in place so that I don't rip the paper as I'm working. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we need to do, I'm gonna have all three of these pieces laid out at a time. And I may jump back and forth between the pieces as I'm working, just to kind of speed up the painting process and use my time as wisely as possible, which I'll explain in a little bit. I'm gonna still have my chart available to me to look at. So I want you to open up your Pablo Picasso Google Slide presentation and start looking at those colors that Picasso used again. Those should be pretty similar to what we have on our chart, and we're going to be using these colors plus neutrals, which means black, white, and brown, in our paintings. Okay, so this is our color palette that we're working with, plus the neutrals, brown, black, white, and gray. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to activate our paints, which, if you recall, just means we're getting those paints ready to use. So I'm getting my brush wet and I am putting one drop of one drop of water into each of my paints. One more in there. That one's a little smaller drop. Okay, so those are going to prepare my paints for use. And while I'm waiting for those to get prepared, I'm going to look at my Google slide presentation and start getting some ideas for the colors and where I want to place them. So I already know the colors I'm going to use, but now I've got to figure out where do I want to place these. So I'm going to take some time and study that Google slide presentation. I want you to pause the video and do the same thing. So I've spent some time reviewing those slides and looking at Picasso's paintings carefully. Now, these paintings are for inspiration and guidance. That doesn't mean that we have to copy them exactly. So one thing I noticed, we'll start with the hair. I noticed that in a lot of the paintings, Picasso used greens or black for the hair with a variety of accent colors. So that's this part where I'm going to start thinking, and mine may not be identical to Picasso's. That's fine, but I'm using it for inspiration. Now, in this video, we're not going to paint the whole thing together. You are all artists who can make choices for yourselves. So within that color palette that we've discussed, so within this color palette, you can use these colors anywhere you want in your painting, and they don't have to match up with the way Picasso used the colors. You also don't have to match it up with where I'm going to paint things. This video is just going to get you started, and I'm going to go over some tips and some suggestions as I paint, but we're not going to paint the entire thing together because you can do that on your own. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to mix up a color. And once I have my color prepared, I'm going to talk about just some tips and some suggestions, okay? So I'm going to mix that up, and then I'll be right back with you. Okay, so I've mixed up two colors that I plan to use in the hair. So I'm going to be using some lime green and also kind of this aqua or turquoise blue. And so I've got those ready. I mixed up my paints, and I've mixed up a fair amount of it so that I don't have to continue to try and make it constantly. So that's one tip I want to give you, is that when you've decided you're going to use a color, especially if you're using it in a large area, make more than you think you need, and then test the color, make sure you like it. Once you're happy with it, then go ahead and paint. But it's always a bummer to have to try and match a color. It can be pretty difficult. So mix up more than you think you need. All right, once you have that color picked out, I'm going to start with this kind of bluish aqua color. And I know that I want these to be kind of like accent colors in the hair of my woman. Yes, this is supposed to be a woman. Some of you have thought they were men. That's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this. Now remember that the reason we use more than one brush or have access to more than one brush is sometimes we need different brushes in different areas. So I'm going to take my time, and I'm going to paint this piece of hair in. Okay, this piece has been painted in. So now what I'm going to decide is there anywhere else that I want to use that color in the hair, and I'm going to paint that part next. If I was painting this piece the same color, I could go ahead and just paint right beside it. I don't plan to, so I'm not going to paint right beside it right now. I'm going to find somewhere else I want to use this color. Okay, so now what I'm going to do while I am waiting for this to dry is I'm going to move on to this piece and paint a little bit over here. So some things to think about so that you're using your time as wisely as possible is that while you're waiting for something over here to dry, you should be painting something on one of these pieces. Some other things you can do if you find yourself in a spot where you need to maybe work a little bit faster, especially if you're working from home, you can take a hair dryer, carefully hold that hair dryer about 6 inches above your painting, and of course with an adult's permission, and you can go ahead and blow dry this so that it dries more quickly. But I'm not going to do that for this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this one aside, and I'm going to use the blue in this piece here. So I'm jumping from one piece to the next so that I'm letting this dry and I'm moving on to this one while that one's drying. Okay, So I want to go over why we're repeating colors. So they don't have to be in the exact same spots, but by using a repetition of colors, so repeating the colors that we're seeing used in this chart, so I'm using this color for the hair right now. By doing that, I'm helping to make sure that when I slide these pieces together, once they've dried and I slide them together, that they're gonna work stylistically in a manner that complements each other. It works together, it works as one whole piece, so it works harmoniously. So that's my reason for repeating the colors and working within that limited color palette. And if I use a color on this piece, I am gonna find somewhere, it doesn't have to be in large quantity, but if I use a color on this piece, odds are I'm gonna use that same color somewhere in this piece to help them work together. Same thing with the stand. So, you know, again, you're gonna be using these colors somewhere on this stand to help it work together, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep painting, and what we'll do is we'll come back once I have completely painted the fronts of these, and we'll look at what we do next, okay? All right. Okay, so let's pause here for a second and talk about what I just did. So you'll notice that I painted an eyelid and a bit of the nose on this one. So why didn't I just go ahead and paint this piece here or this piece here and just finish up the hair? Well, the reason I didn't want to paint and finish the hair right away is I knew that there was potential that this area still may be wet. So all of these areas I had just painted in, I was not sure if they were dry yet. So remember that if we paint watercolors side by side, two different colors, and those areas are wet, there is potential that they will bleed together or run together. So I chose to paint a different area that was not touching any pieces of hair that I had just painted because I knew that those areas would be safe to paint without running or bleeding into another area. Okay, so you're gonna see me hop around as I paint and start painting different pieces. And the thought process is always, where am I gonna paint next that it's safe to paint? I can take my time, I can use my time wisely, I can continue painting, but I'm not gonna have my colors run together, okay? The other thing that I'm doing as I'm going and painting in different sections is I'm making kind of a plan in my head, and I'm referring back to that Pablo Picasso Google slide presentation, and I'm studying how did he use the colors, where did he use them. That doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily copy them, but it gives me some ideas of where I want to use colors and how I want to use those colors. So make sure that you are establishing a plan and you're thinking and being thoughtful about your color placement. So right now, I'm pretty confident this is dry. So I'm gonna go ahead, since I have that plan for the colors that I want the hair to be in my head, I'm gonna go ahead and paint the next section of the hair in because I'm pretty sure the hair has dried. And remember, you do not have to match your colors to what I'm doing in this video. Meaning, if you wanted to have the hair be, red, orange, and yellow, that's fine. But remember, you are making your choices based on the colors that are on our chart and that we're seeing in Picasso's paintings. Okay, so hopefully at this point you're feeling pretty confident about how I want you to approach the painting process, and you know what you need and you've gotten those tips and suggestions. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna come back when these are done on one side and we'll talk about doing the next side. All right. All right, so it's been about an hour and I finished painting both of the pieces. I haven't fully finished painting this. That's okay, I can keep working, but I want to talk about what to do once these two pieces are done and they've had time to dry. So mine have been sitting here for about half an hour and they're fully dry. So the next step in this assignment would be to turn these over and to begin to paint the backs, because we want both sides painted, okay? Now you have a couple of choices. You can repeat the colors that you did on the front exactly the same on the back, okay? So I could use this as a guide and make these colors exactly the same. One tip you might want to try doing if you're going to do that is use your phone or your computer, take a picture so that you can remember what color went where, okay? So again, that's up to you. If you want this to match exactly, you're going to use the same exact colors in the same exact areas. Now, if you had something happen like I did, whereas we get real close, we can see I have a little bit of watercolor that just came through that cut on the back as I was working. So I'm not that concerned about it because my plan was to use the same colors I used on the front on the back. So this yellow is going to be the color, that kind of like yellow orange kind of ochre color. That's the color I'm going to continue using for the skin, so that doesn't bother me. And when I look at this, I have this kind of like red orange happening right here. That's the color it was on the front. This blue is the same color as it was on the front. Now here we have maybe some issues where I might have to make some adjustments and change things because I have blue 2 in a row. But those are like minor issues, and as artists, you need to be able to work with mistakes that happen and adjust and find a way to make it work for you, okay? So you could do something where this is almost fully identical to the front, but maybe there are a few changes. You can do it totally different. It's really your decision. I would stick with those same color palette that we've been working in. But again, it's up to you how you choose to paint the backs. So same thing here, I'm gonna paint the back of this, my choice, whether I keep the colors the same or whether I make them look different. If you wanna go ahead once they're dry and kind of just get an idea for the way your artwork is looking, you can put those pieces together and kind of get a feel for the way things are looking. Check it out. So of course we definitely want to paint this, because if we don't, that's going to be really shockingly white. So we're going to make sure that we paint both sides of that. You also need to make sure that your stand gets completed. Once all of this has been painted on both sides and the stand is completed and everything's dry, we will move on to the very last step, which is figuring out where to make the cuts in the base or the stand so that your sculpture can be supported and stand upright. One thing I want to point out is that clearly my pieces are very different from what we see in the Picasso paintings. That's absolutely fine. We're using this as a jumping off point. So, you know, if you're looking at yours and it's more colorful or less colorful, that's fine. Remember that this is what we're doing is we're using Picasso as inspiration, as a guide, but we're not copying it, okay? So it is okay for yours to look different.